This morning I'm going to do something probably a little different. I'm going to do a Bible lesson. I don't often do that, but this one particularly struck me as a couple of weeks ago I was in a Bible study and somebody pointed out a different take on a familiar story. And it is the parable of the talents. But first of all, I'd like you to imagine living in a country where those at the top seem to have all the power. Usury and greed are the rule of the day. Taxes are paid from the bottom up. Those at the top pay little or nothing. A country where the wealth gap gets wider and seemingly every day. Imagine living in a country where at any moment the overlords can take away your means of living, take away your property without so much as batting an eye, and corruption rules the day. I'm going to read to you a familiar parable. It's the parable of the talents. Let's see here. Should come up. I'll have to do this again. Parable of the talents is something that we ministers often use when it comes around to that time of year where we have to give the sermon on the amount. Talk about giving and tithing of our talent and our treasures. But I was kind of taken aback when I heard a different interpretation of that. And it talks about some of the difficult parts of that parable, things that just never made sense to me, even though I tried to bring that part of the story into some sort of spiritual sense that would teach us something about giving, that would point the way toward a loving and generous God. That story never did that. So, here we are. I apologize, I had it up. I actually forgot my Bible. The time change got to me this morning. Okay. Well, here we go. I may have to just paraphrase it.
What was the verse again? I got it right here.
Okay.
What is it?
It is Matthew
Yep.
25, 14 to 30. Be easier to read from the pad anyway.
Matthew 25, what was the number?
14 through 30.
I can read the red here.
Okay. All right. So, Jesus starts his parable off with his statement, the kingdom of heaven is as a man traveling into a far country, who called his own servants and delivered unto them his goods. And unto one he gave 5 talents, and to another 2 talents, and to another just 1. And every man according to his several ability, and straightway took his journey. Then he that had received the 5 talents went and traded the same, and made them another 5 talents. And likewise, he that had received 2, he also gained 2 more. But he that had received 1 went and dug a hole in the earth and hid his Lord's money. After a long time, the Lord of those servants came and reckoned with them. And so he that had received 5 talents came and brought the other 5 talents, saying, Lord, thou did deliver unto me 5 talents, and behold, I gained beside them 5 talents more. His Lord said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. He that also had received 2 talents came and said, Lord, you delivered me 2 talents, and behold, I have gained 2 other talents beside them. His Lord said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. I will make you a ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of the Lord. Then he who had received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew that you are a hard man, reaping where you have not sown, and gathering where you have not strewn. And I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the earth. Lo, there is what you have is yours back again. And the Lord answered and said, You wicked and lazy servant, you know that I reap where I did not sow, and gather where I have not sown seed. Thou ought therefore put my money you should have put the money into the exchangers, and then at my coming I should have received my own with usury. Take therefore the talent from him, and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For unto everyone that has shall be given, and he shall have abundance. But from him that hath not shall be taken away even more than that which he has. And cast the unprofitable servant into the outer darkness. And there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So, lots of things there have puzzled me. The country that I was talking about was 1st century Palestine, the time in which Jesus lived, the time in which the Christ walked the earth. And some of the ways that this parable disturbed me, well, first of all, the master is called Lord, but in the Bible it is a small L. So I've always taught that Lord is the Lord of your consciousness. As is it a small L, Lord, ways of the world that are ruling your mind? Or is it a large L, Lord, God consciousness that rules your mind? So here we have, this story that we've always assumed that the master speaking here is God, and that we are the servants. And in some translations, the word servant is slave, which makes it a very different relationship with the master between being a servant and a slave. And so these people are really slaves to the master. And you'll see why in a moment. So perhaps there is another meaning to this parable. Parables are earthly stories about a heavenly truth. And looking at this parable again, we can notice some things that could cause us to question what we've always known about. This parable is strictly about money. It's not about our spiritual gifts or talents. It's about money. A talent was a measure of silver, very high value. A talent is about 50 to 75 pounds of pure silver. That's a lot of money. It has nothing to do with the gifts, the talents that we might share. It has to do with, it has nothing to do with how well you usher, or how well you may cook, or how much money you put in the offering every Sunday. It has to do with a talent, which is money. And it's about the use and misuse of it. We often use "as you give, so shall you receive" to entice giving as making an investment. More importantly, the master doesn't fit the description of a loving, compassionate, forgiving God. Not the God I know. So one time I was in a study group, and the leader of the group said, "What's your vision of hell?" And of course my answer was, I don't have a vision of hell because it's consciousness. There's no physical place called hell. And of course they all, and I said, and one woman said, "Well, didn't your parents punish you when you were a child?" I said, "Yeah, but they loved me. They didn't condemn me to eternal hell fire." That didn't make sense to me. So it doesn't sound like the God that Jesus came to reveal. The slave says to him, "I knew you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter seed." And the master doesn't dispute this at all. He reinforces it. He said, You knew that I reap where I did not sow, and gather where I did not scatter. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. Does that sound like the God that we talk about around here? Doesn't to me. And in fact, there are several Old Testament laws forbidding charging interest. Orthodox Muslims practice these laws even today. So there was the first two were in violation of Jewish law. They went out and doubled the money they had received. We don't know how they did it, but they did it. And I think that 100% interest on return can be described as exorbitant. None of us would take out a credit card that had 100% interest on it, would we? Payday loans go up to like 350% interest. Here's another inconsistency in the story. The master enforces a penalty against the slave. He said, "Take his talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For those who have more will be given, and they will have abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away." What would we say to that? The rich get rich, and the poor get poorer. We hear a lot today about the widening gap between the wealthiest people in our country and everyone else. The 1% and the 99%. Which category do you fall into? At the time, Jesus was giving this parable to his disciples, and it was a time when land was the only reliable form of wealth. Thus the name that we use today, real estate, was the only real thing. In a country where good, productive land was at a premium, the well-to-do had to find a way to get more of it, a way to pry the land from the less fortunate. They found that perfect mechanism for that, the manipulation of debt. Higher taxes, paid both to Rome and the ruling class of Palestine. When the peasant landowners could not pay their taxes or other bills to the upper crust, the wealthy would save the day with bailouts, given with interest charges. When they couldn't pay these, they fell deeper and deeper into debt. Most of you are not old enough to remember a song by Tennessee Ernie Ford. I was a kid. It's an old song called 16 Tons. You load 16 tons, and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I give my soul to the company store. It's about a coal miner living in a company town, owned by the company, the land's owned by the company, the mine's owned by the company, all of the church, the stores, everything. So they would get their pay their taxes, then they could buy anything they wanted at the company store on credit. And so they had to keep going back to work, back to work, back to work, and not getting anywhere. Eventually, the wealthy would foreclose and force the peasants off the land, or allow them to stay on as sharecroppers. When the crops were good, it was a reasonable situation. But when the crops were bad, the landowners then could foreclose on the property completely. These are the very people Jesus so often challenged and complained about. Those who lack compassion and were driven by greed. And I want you to hear, I'm not anti-wealth, I'm anti-greed, where you're using other people to get what you want to get to. You know, a line from the musical Annie. Daddy Warbucks says, it doesn't matter who you step on climbing up the ladder, as long as you don't plan on coming down. So the first two slaves in this parable also knew about the master's game. And to stay in favor, they did exactly what the master expected them to do, and they were rewarded. We call them sycophants. The third slave, he was a problem. Instead of investing in the money and doubling the master's wealth, he buried it in the ground. And when the master came, when it came time to call accounts, the master calls this slave wicked and lazy. I don't see him as wicked and lazy. In fact, this one is more like Jesus than any of the others in the story. This one is courageous and speaks the truth to power. And if you remember, at the crucifixion, before Jesus is crucified and he's going through these trials, you know, and Pontius Pilate says something, you know, about being powerful, and Jesus said, you would have no power except for God, except for my Father giving it to you. He spoke the truth to power. So this one refused to play the master's game of usury and illegal gain by speaking what he knew to be true, by speaking from a place of consciousness that understands spiritual law and spiritual principle. There was a story a while ago in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. A 93-year-old man was arrested for serving food to homeless people. Maybe you remember the story. He was doing what Jesus would do. But it seems that he broke the law. The city had passed an ordinance making it a crime to feed the poor because it would reduce their incentive to get off the streets. We often hear this from those higher up. First of all, we don't want to look at you. You must be wicked and lazy. Go and get a job. Make yourself useful. Do what we tell you to do. Useful to us. So I see with all of the turmoil and the upset in our world today, Jesus gives us a pattern. Jesus tells us, speak the truth to power. You remember his saying in the temple, you have made my father's house a den of thieves. Because all the people came to Jerusalem for, Passover, and they may not have brought their sacrificial animals with them, so there was usury. Think it's something like the cost of Purell today. They charge more for not so good livestock to be sacrificed in the temple. The money changers, again, tax them for exchanging their money for money that could be used in Jerusalem. So, will we continue to be compliant to an unfair system like the first two slaves? We're again in a place where we can make a choice. Or will we side with the third and refuse to play their game of corruption? Because that game is in direct opposition to God's laws. Scary stuff. It seems as if there's nothing we can do about it. But are we courageous enough to do what the third slave did? To be more like Jesus. To speak the truth. Am I willing to pay the price of speaking my truth? Just recently, I paid the price of speaking truth to power. Not the first time that it happened, it probably won't be the last. I lost my job. Told the guy who was sitting there saying you're going to be terminated, great, I was going to quit anyway. They had a reason for why they were going to let me go. But I had a sneaking suspicion was that I had no qualms about speaking my truth. I was in the suggestion box all the time. I was complaining about unfair treatment of customers on the phone and how they might manage that better. I was always aware of the ways that they chose to not pay the people on the bottom line with rules and regulations that were not compassionate, not caring. They just cared about how much money they were going to save. Am I willing to pay that game? Never have been. And I can do that. I can do that because I know, and you know, that God's got your back. When you are standing in truth, God's got your back. Always has. I'll never be wealthy because I'm not willing to play the game, I guess. But I've never gone without a roof over my head. Never not put a meal on the table. Raised my son. And here I am. Still being able to stand in my truth. Are we willing to make that sacrifice? You know, this is the period of Lent when we look at the consequences that Jesus paid for speaking the truth. It's a tough time for us to look at the things that maybe we should be giving up because they don't serve us anymore, because they aren't in compliance with what God expects of us, to be like Jesus. Some tough questions, but I think necessary. As I absolutely believe that we are at the precipice of making that shift in consciousness that will change the way the world works. We've been working at it for 2,000 years. We have to keep working. And I know God is blessing us now in every way. And so it is.